Okay, let's go ahead and get started this morning. Welcome, everybody. I hope most of you have not had the same peeping crud that I've had for the last 4 weeks. It has not been fun. But anyway, that's enough of my tale of woe. And let's just get started this morning. So, in a little while, we're going to hear from Randy. Most of you know Randy. He's been a pretty regular attendee and shared a lot of great information with us over time, and is going to talk about what you think you know, what you don't know about LEOs. And so I think that he and I had a great conversation about that a couple of weeks ago. So I think you're going to find that to be a really informative thing. And I know Mark and others are going to jump in on that conversation also in just a little bit. Um, so with that, let me just as I said, let's just go ahead and get started this morning. And I want to just start quickly, Randy, with you and Mark, with any federal updates that you may be aware of before we get into your LEO presentation, Randy.
Um,
Um,
Mark, go ahead.
yeah, the biggest thing on the horizon and a hopeful sign is that there is something called the Success for BEAD Act, introduced in the Senate and mirrored by a identical bill in the House, a bipartisan sponsorship and bicameral being both houses, and it would uh, basically insist or legislate that the states have access to their non-deployment funds. So of Arizona's 993 million, there's about 500 million or so left, and that money has been in limbo. Early, many of us were skeptical, that it would become available, or at least that the feds would try to claw it back. And it appears increasingly likely that one way or another, that money will become available to the states. There have been other signs indicating that from Ariel Roth, the director of the NTIA, from Trump in an executive order about AI regulation in the states, specifically mentions states' use of those funds, and so on. So, the big hopeful signs are there that in 2026, that will be uh, uh, either law or NTIA will have acted on their own without that law to make those funds available. The law does, in the draft law, does include a shot clock that the NTIA would have to provide guidance on the program within 30 days of its being signed into law by the president. So, hopeful signs there on non-deployment funding. Randy, what do you got? Anything else?
let's see. Nothing that is sort of organized. I've been heads down on satellite just because that my head's been focused on that for just the last couple days.
Sure.
Okay. And I don't know that there's been a whole lot of other stuff. Where's Mala? There she is. So Mala, is there anything that's been happening, Universal Service Fund, or anything that we need to be aware of at this point?
No, the Universal Service Fund, there's nothing, no talks, nothing happening. My only, I think we need to focus a little bit more on the plan, the BEAD plan that ACA had up on its website. The one that where we talked about what we could do for the other fund, the Digital Inclusion Fund, because what that fund has gone away now, but we might be able to use some of the planning that we did there for the non-deployment funds, because those are the kind of the very areas that um, Ariel Roth spoke about, including in the non-deployment fund when she was being asked questions at the meeting last Wednesday. So I'm hopeful that if we can revive that and take a closer look at the plan, we should be in a good position to use the non-deployment funds when it is made available. And
Well,
right
we're
now, I think the guidelines are being done. That's what the last thing that Ariel Roth mentioned at that meeting was that they are working on the guidelines. So hopefully, it's going to pan out soon.
And I'll mention one more thing about the bill. It does kind of broaden the potential uses of the non-deployment funding to what I really do consider deployments. It allows for states to support the build of middle mile wholesale fiber, they call it infrastructure, internet exchange points, and some other matters in mobile and wireless, surprisingly, infrastructure that was not at all supported in the deployment funds, mobile and mobile type wireless is supportable by, and states will have to choose how they steer their program. So Mala is right. We should be working with the ABO as things emerge for the Arizona spin. All of the uses defined by NTIA or in the bill are not required for the state, but rather more like a menu from the state to pick and choose in their own implementation.
Right.
okay.
And the things that she was talking about including were digital skills training, broadband adoption programs, device subsidies, all of those things that were in our original digital inclusion plan. And the organizations that contributed to that plan, I think, would still be able to contribute to this
Right. Hopefully.
non-deployment. Yeah, hopefully.
Absolutely. Good
Mhm.
point, Mala. And one more thing about BEAD is that the GAO, the General Accounting Office, has now ruled that the NTIA's wholesale changes in the program made in June 2024 under the new administration were illegal, that they had to have congressional approval, which NTIA did not seek or get. Um, I was initially more worried that that might lead to program delays, but most of the analysis I've seen in recent days and weeks has been that it's probably will be a tempest in a teapot. Either the Congress will approve those rules or some other finesse will happen, but there is a bit of a bugaboo out there in that the rule changes that then guided the reset and restart of the BEAD program were deemed illegal without congressional approval. It was an agency rule change
Oh,
that GAO determined needed congressional approval.
it's hard to tell these days what the people are thinking up in Washington these days. Aaron, do you want to comment at all about since you were very instrumental in developing that plan originally?
I mean, I don't really have any additional insights since I'm not with ACA anymore of what's going on there. But just as a reminder, the plan itself is still available, linked on the AIDEN website. I did drop a link to that in the chat. It hadn't been on the ACA website since the termination of the grant. So if you hadn't already saved it, there's a spot to get it. And in related news, today's AIDEN meeting at noon, we will actually be kind of talking a little bit about some of these things, planning for AIDEN in the next couple of years. And, I think that this is a timely conversation since, organizations such as this one and AIDEN are still doing all of that work that we, knew they were doing at the time of the plan. And so, it's a good time to be a part of that kind of conversation. So,
Okay. Thank you, Aaron.
Uh,
Okay.
just
Sorry.
one follow up. I'm making a post to put in the link, but to Aaron's point about the availability of the original plans and documents. There is an NTIA site called Public Resources Related to Bead Plants and Milestones, and it has all of the plans from every state. And I guess it doesn't have the Gosh, I'm looking at it now. It doesn't have the digital equity plan, but it has 5-year action plan, initial proposals, 1 and 2, state challenge process, benefit of the bargain process, and the final proposal for Arizona says coming soon, and an overview document. So it is a useful site, not only for Arizona, but every state or territory you might have an interest in. So I'll post that in just a minute or so.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. Anybody else have anything regarding this topic right now before we just jump over to Randy?
Steve, the one thing I wanted to mention, I put it in the chat. That's the link to the permit finder, broadband permit finder,
Yeah.
that was approved and up and running. It's on the ACA website, of course, and as well as publicized on the governor's website. Whatever that's called now, I don't remember exactly what it's called now. But that is really the first of its kind in the country, and in fact, it not only shows where the permits have already been given, but gives links to, you know, speeding up the process of getting it, and it reduces a lot of the barriers, of um, it doesn't actually tell you, I mean, it doesn't get you the signed paper document, but at least gives you the forms that you need to fill, the regulatory processes, and it accelerates the whole pace of doing the permitting process. So I think it's a very good tool to use. And I think Sandra Watson, the CEO of ACAs, talked about it as streamlining the infrastructure permitting with this innovative resource, and about how it accelerates the deployment of the underserved and rural areas, which is what is going to be the focus for our BEAD. And that means, sooner shovels on the ground rather than waiting for all the permits and processes.
I think Arizona's been getting some good accolades for that permit
Mhm.
finder.
Right.
Okay, anything else before we jump over to Randy? If not, again, I think most of you have heard Randy speak, present to this group before. As I mentioned, that we're going to be talking about LEOs today, and Randy and I had a great conversation a couple of weeks ago. I learned a lot just within that conversation and understanding exactly what LEOs are. But it's more than LEOs. And what are they? But how are they being deployed, and how does it relate to BEAD and BEAD funding? How does it relate to communities? How does it relate to individuals? I mean, there's a whole lot of issues and surround LEOs. Of course, there's political issues also. But anyway, I'm going to just turn it over to Randy. And Randy, you want to just introduce yourself quickly? And if you need to share stuff, I'll just let you go ahead and share whatever you want to.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Steve. And yeah, it's just a little bit of background too. Um, I've occasionally introduced myself as a recovering satellite hardware design engineer, and if I rewind, almost 4 decades, yeah, that was what I was doing. So I have kind of a season of that kind of experience, and then I've worked in the wireless telecommunications industry, basically with a major cellular operator that grew in the U.S. and became dominant in Europe for about 20 years. And then I also, sort of during that season, did one of the first commercial low Earth orbit satellite, system designs that we invested and built it and fielded it. And it was sort of voice oriented, but it was a precursor, a major precursor to the kind of stuff that's going on right now. And then, currently, as I think many of you know, broadbandtoolkit.com is focused on infrastructure oriented tools and also digital opportunity. But we have analytics toolkits. But a lot of our revenue comes from fiber. So I'd say I have a personally just a background that has deep legs in each of these different areas. And so part of the discussion that Steve and I had the other day was just, yeah, I think it's very easy, since there's been a lot of contest between how much fiber do we do and are the rule changes appropriate or not, to sort of feel like, for people to feel like I've been on Team Fiber and we've lost, and to kind of think of satellite in that context. But I think there's a ton of other stuff that's happening in the LEO world that's very, very consequential that just is important to understand. And so I put together a presentation showing a lot of those consequential news items. And I know Mark has done a ton in the arena as well. And so, Mark, you can correct me if I go astray on any of the details here, but hopefully
Can I correct you if you're right? No, just joking.
uh, so here we go. I'm gonna share
So while you're
this.
doing that, Randy, I just wanted to mention, so Bill DiAugustino, I told you already, and Brian Daly and others who are focused in the wireless space. If you got anything to contribute to any of this, please feel free to jump in.
Will do.
Good. So just a bit of context here. So there's was some action by the FCC on last Friday, and so I was going to kind of lead with that because that's kind of very interesting. And then also just some things that have hit the press as things to read or events that are helpful updates in terms of the satellite arena. Talk a little bit about what's happened with BEAD because that's significant concepts and terminologies, and then important trends. And so, what's interesting with low Earth orbit satellites is they're not static, and a lot has changed. And then finally, the a capital market view as we look across technologies and how technologies are competing and how companies are capitalized. Yeah, there are some important takeaways there. So this came out, and this is just a snapshot from one page, but this was basically an authorization and order from the commission, and it was specifically directed towards SpaceX, and basically authorized another 7,500 Generation 2 satellites, and also granted them a lot of the things that they'd been requested in terms of additional spectrum and liberalization of rules. And just to give a quick snapshot here, so they have a majority of their satellites right now are sort of their Gen 2. So this just formally authorizes a larger number, more orbital shells. There have been a lot of restrictions right now that have been in place in terms of how they operate the network, in terms of using adjacent channels and different polarizations in the same location. A lot of these have been designed to protect companies that are offering geosynchronous satellite service. So a lot of those have been relaxed, and that's going to have the impact of letting them significantly increase performance. And so that's it's actually very consequential. And what's interesting, and I'll unpack all of these things in more detail in a moment, but the FCC Space Division is moving increasingly into what they call kind of a rules-based approach, where they create a framework and they say, if you're a satellite provider, propose something that fits within this box, and if you do, we'll fast track it, or it'll happen a lot faster. And so a lot of what is happening here sort of fits that pattern. And a lot of these changes will also benefit other low Earth orbit providers like Amazon. So let's see, my screen is okay. So in terms of interesting and important reading, the New America Leo symposium was actually really a very consequential event and lots of good stuff. Jay Schwartz, who's the FCC Space Bureau chief, gave a very nice talk. And it sort of has the feel of the 1960s race to the moon. It's a really interesting discussion of just how the commission is viewing the role of space launch and low Earth orbit satellites and others. Also has a very good LEO satellite tutorial. And then there's the NTIA did a program on low Earth orbit, and I've got some links there. And I'll drop this whole presentation with the links in the chat. And then finally, there's the white paper that I put together about 6 or 8 months ago. And even though some things have changed, all of the links still point to people who have information that's being refreshed, every few days. And so things like satellite counts. And so I would encourage you to download a copy if you don't have one. So just a little bit about satellite, about low Earth orbit and BEAD. Currently, it's coming in at about 22% of of, um, of locations, and this is the Connected Nation BEAD tracker. And then interestingly, too, SpaceX and Amazon, what was formerly Amazon Kuiper and now just, I believe, Amazon Leo, a little bit of rebranding, have pretty much split the market. And so there's been, I think, a lot of appetite in most states in many states to do dual awards. This is a slide that I put together that I thought would be helpful just to contrast some of the frameworks between fiber and satellite. With fiber, I mean, you can have things that are immensely expensive, but I sort of put 1,000 to 10,000 per passing as a range which is common. And of course, at the high end, you're probably not going to do that without government subsidy. And BEAD generally falls a little bit below that. If you find homes for less than 1,000 and you're an ISP, invest because there aren't that many left. Those have pretty much been done. But what's interesting is the fiber has a lot of high upfront cost, but then the cost of bandwidth is sort of very close to zero. And also, notably, it has a 30-year plus, mission life, if you want to use that term, which is a satellite term. With low Earth orbit satellite, the cost of actually passing a home is about 3 orders of magnitude less. So it comes out to about $1 to $3 per passing, and you can get that by taking the system cost and dividing by globally the number of households. And so the cost of just being able to provide service is almost zero. However, there are two constraints. One is there is a minimum constellation size. So SpaceX has spent on the order of $10 billion on their network, and probably a half or a third of that kind of got them to the kind of the minimum viable solution. But then also as you use usage, there's an incremental cost, and so this is a characteristic of satellite, also of terrestrial wireless, and so it's very, very important for people to understand these structural differences between technologies. And notably, like on fiber, you've got a drop plus indoor wiring plus CPE. With satellite, you have the installation of the user antenna, indoor wiring, and CPE. So these are sort of parallel costs that need to be captured. In terms of risks and limitations, fiber, and again, I think there are very few places where fiber directly competes with satellite just because they're optimized in such different arenas. But with fires, particularly with aerial fiber cuts, road widenings, squirrels, frost heaves. With undersea fiber, you've got things like undersea volcanic events and even ocean-going vessels dragging their anchors that can impact the undersea cable. With satellite, you have a completely different set of things. You have potentially acts of war, like you could explode a cluster bomb in um, low Earth orbit that could destroy a lot of the satellites there. And there have been rumors that Russia is, pondering that. It would be catastrophic, though, for pretty much all nations and might wipe out the band for, a decade or two. Weather is typically an issue with satellite, less so in the low Earth orbit. And then, there are also notably restrictions where you can't deploy it in a forest because your KU band is not going to blast through leaves, or if it's obstructed by mountains, or in cities, where there's very high density, or even in multi-tenant environments, it's difficult. Um, and then I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but I wanted to. Steve and I talked about just the contrast of subgrantee obligations. So with fiber, usually, they have a 25% match, and then get funded for the rest. The ISP pays all ongoing operational costs, and then they incur drop costs, indoor wiring, CPE, and so forth. So that's sort of a parallels the traditional fiber model. So with satellite, the NTIA needed to come up with something a little bit different for a couple reasons. One is you can't repossess a satellite if the operator fails to deliver. So the same kind of period of interest that accrues for terrestrial networks doesn't apply. So what's interesting here is the satellite provider will declare a point in time where they are available for service. They've got 10 days to deploy, just like a terrestrial provider. And then basically they're paid over a 10-year period, and there's several different models for this. And their letter of credit obligations amortize, also typically based on adoption target, kind of a combination of adoption targets and the passage of time. But they are generally obligated to act to get people to adopt it, which makes it a little different. And this is described in appendix. Actually, I said I think it's appendix B and C, but it's um, the um, uh, the restructuring notice, the or yeah, B and C in the restructuring notice. So just a few concepts. We often talk about low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, and then geosynchronous. LEO is typically 300 to 1,000 kilometers, just generously, and it has the attribute that you've got a lot of satellites. They're moving. With Starlink and with Amazon, it's roughly a 90-minute orbit. So a satellite's in view for just a few minutes. Geosynchronous is what we've had for decades, and it's at 22,300 miles, and sort of sits there, and your dish points to it, and there are a lot of system implications. And then medium Earth, things like GPS would be MEO, but it's sort of less used in today's architecture. But it's also a mobile satellite, so it moves. But there are big implications for the cost per satellite, number of satellites, latency, and just with LEO, you're serving the entire planet, versus with GEO, you may serve a country or the U.S. But it could be a very compact area. The other thing that's very, very important, and pretty much across satellite systems, is the customer premise equipment, or specifically the dish, and the size and sophistication of the dish is extremely important. So if you spend more on a larger satellite dish, and this would be a business class dish, say with Starlink, you will get significantly better performance, and also the economics improve for the satellite provider as well. So that's very, very material when you think about how you approach things. A lot of people, like I've read articles where people say, Leos are only going to last for 5 years, and that's true, but it's just kind of the nature of the beast. So if you're investing in a low Earth orbit architecture, you know that you've got to replenish the constellation at about that interval. And then technologies will evolve by adding to the constellation, uh, replacing aging satellites, and software upgrades in every piece of the system. And then a couple, these are just a few things that Steve and I talked about as well, which are markets people may not realize. So even if satellites, low Earth orbit was never used for BEAD, these are all sorts of things that are happening. Commercial aviation, you can get a gigabit per second on your transcontinental flight, which is great. Cruise lines can get sort of 3 gigabits per second in a ship in international waters because there a lot of the rules within the US or other specific countries get relaxed, and so you can do that. We live in a world where if you have an RV, you can go on vacation and write blogs and do Zooms and do lots of exciting stuff from your RV using satellite. Commercial shipping, so boats carrying containers or oil, great connectivity. Private yachts, there's a whole pricing segment for that. Disaster zones and conflict zones, like they say in Iran right now that there are an estimate of 50,000 Starlink terminals, but also after hurricanes and a lot of places where other communication systems are not operating. There's a that's one thing that people use. Two applications that are noteworthy. One is the with Starlink using it as a middle mile connection. So we often think about you've got this little dish and you put it on your house and that provides consumer connectivity. There's also what they call a community gateway, where it's basically $1 million installation. The monthly fee isn't $120, it's $75,000 per gigabit per second. It's a QoS service, and so its performance is measured every 250 milliseconds, but it's basically used as a backbone for an ISP. So, and there's a story that Starling tells, and I interviewed the person doing this, and there's a big section in my white paper on a little place in the Aleutian Islands on the Bering Sea where they're using this, and it's sort of a middle mile backhaul for fiber, cable, DSL, fixed wireless, and mobile broadband systems. So lots of capability there. And then another thing that again a community pretty much anywhere could do is you could buy a business class dish and then attach it to some sort of fixed wireless or in building and distribute it. So this would be an alternative architecture to having an individual residential dish. It could be very powerful, but it requires some management. And then just a quick thing about just how with right now we know a lot about Starlink because they're commercial. Amazon will learn about it, but we don't know a lot right now. But this Starlink has plans that are innovative and changing. So they historically kind of launched with their kind of residential all you can eat plan for $120. They now have a 200 megabit and 100 megabit plan for less that are offered in specific areas, not everywhere, but some places. They're now advertising is 99.9 uptime, weather resistant, and so forth. They also have roaming features. So if you have an RV, or even if someone has say a summer home, you could subscribe to the roaming and turn it off for 10 months out of the year when you're not there. So those are interesting things that are evolving. And also the roaming works in 150 plus countries. So that's also a dimension to the way that they're structuring things that's very different than fixed. On the business plan, you see a bunch of different amounts per month. So if you wanted a terabyte of usage per month, and the typical residential user is 650 to 700. So if you have a high speed, maybe fiber or high speed cable connection, that's sort of a typical usage. So you would you check all the boxes there and have lots left over, and you would and that and usually businesses use less than residences because they're not streaming TV all day, so actually there's and here again they have sort of single use and in motion, and then single country and multi-country, including using things at sea. So a lot of range of different business plans here, and that's sort of the takeaway. Um, so now I'm going to just take a moment and get into into just the comparing some of the systems. So with each system, you have the number of satellites launched. So if you put a satellite in a rocket and put it into space as launched, you have the number that are working. So you've got a small percentage that are essentially dead on arrival when they end up in space, and so that's a discount. And then you have some that are retired. They've reached end of life. And then importantly, once you have satellites up into the atmosphere or into space, it often takes about 3 months to get what you've just launched for all of them to get into their orbital locations. And once they do that, we say they're on orbit, and at that point they're actually delivering service. So for each system, you can look at each of these metrics. Starlink, OneWeb, which is more sort of business government focused, is sort of another player. They're actually a mixed LEO GEO. And then Amazon, and they have launched 182 satellites and have 87 on station. So and just an interesting thing with Amazon is they originally filed for a system with 3,236 satellites, and the FCC granted their application with a requirement that half would be in orbit by July 30th of this year. And basically, they're not going to hit those deadlines, and that is potentially very consequential for them legally, just because their permit could be pulled. Generally, the expectation is that the FCC will cut them slack just because they've been awarded about half of the BEAD locations, and people are very, very eager to have a second competitor in the low Earth orbit space. And I think people expect once they get everything launched, they'll do extremely well. So anyway, but that's sort of a regulatory twist there. This is a slide here talking about launch cadence. So this is not the number of satellites, but the number of launches. In other words, how often do they, do a countdown to zero and launch a rocket into space with satellites? Right now, it's about once every 3 days. So in 2025, there were 127 SpaceX launches with Starlink satellites. So it's a ton of activity. I mentioned here too, SpaceX is not only Starlink is not only growing their constellation, but they're also migrating to Gen 2. Currently, they have about 9 million subscribers globally. Some people say 2.5 million of those in the US. And then BEAD is an expected 472,000. So one of the interesting things is BEAD is about 5% of what they currently have. So from a Starlink perspective, BEAD is nice to have, but it's not driving the business. Other things are. And then here's just a quick sort of competitive and capital markets view. So if we look at all technologies for broadband in the US, you've got 31 million with Comcast, so they're sort of leading the pack. If you look at fiber specifically, 10 million with AT&T. You also see each of the cellular subscribers with significant numbers that are sort of leveraging 4G, 5G investments, and so the fixed wireless based on 4G, 5G is also a big segment. But what's interesting here is if you look at Starlink, they are the total number of subscribers is competing with sort of the largest fiber providers, although what they're providing is completely different. So the paradox is if you're in a local town and you have fiber, I mean, you would just buy fiber and you wouldn't even think about satellite, and it'd be sort of a no-brainer. But if you step back and look at the global picture, satellite is very, very consequential. And even within a 47-day period, they added 1 million subscribers. So that's as many as Lumen has added, in their life. So the cadence here is very, very fast. And then this is just a final picture here, just looking at from a capital market perspective. The number of companies that have $1 trillion market cap or greater are few. There, about a dozen. And what's interesting is a lot of them are U.S. companies. Many of them are technology companies. There's also Berkshire Hathaway, Eli Lilly, and Saudi Aramco, which isn't on here because we don't know the exact number, but they're obviously oil and gas. But what's interesting here is Amazon, is the fifth largest company on the planet, and they are one of the contenders. And so their Amazon Leo is really pocket change compared to the capital, assets and resources of the company. They also have probably one of the lowest cost of capital, and also they have other parts of the business so they could leverage this. A large portion of what happens on the web is hosted on Amazon Web Services, and so there's a likely synergy between their Leo and web services. We just don't know exactly what that is. Starlink, SpaceX is doing Starlink, and they also dominate the space of the launch industry. They recently had a private placement valuing them at about $400 billion, and they're expecting an IPO in late this year that'll value them at about 800 million. So they're getting very close to the $1 trillion value. And Comcast, that we saw in the previous page, is leading in the broadband space, is about 0.1 trillion in market cap, and part of that is associated with their media assets, not even broadband. So this is an interesting picture of just the way capital markets view all of this. So satellite has gone from something that people were dismissive of a few years ago to something that's very consequential. And even the regulatory changes of about a week ago, I think we're going to see big improvements in the performance. So for people who had got awarded satellite for BEAD, I think there's a good chance that they will be pleasantly surprised by the time all of this stuff rolls out. And SpaceX is even talking about gigabit service in 2026. And then the other piece that I haven't mentioned here is Starship is their huge new launch vehicle, and it's been going through testing and launches and so forth, and is getting closer to actually being viable and being able to go to orbit and do all the stuff it needs to do. That'll also have a big positive impact for SpaceX. So anyway, that's an earful. So let me just stop and pause there and just see if there are comments. I know that the chat has got a bunch of stuff, and I've been yeah. So anyway, let's maybe open it to whoever wants to comment here. And I see there's a bunch of stuff going on here.
Yeah, I have a question, Randy. Um, is there an assessment of what the maximum total LEO satellites that can be deployed by all providers in terms of, capacity and space to support them, and how much bandwidth would be totally available, there, so you could assess how many customers could really be supported globally with these LEO satellites?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So one of the, I guess one data point is the Jonathan's website. Let's see, and that I had a link in here. But basically, he tracks the number of satellites of each system and all the different systems. But they get into the hundreds of thousands, and there are like China has a bunch of stuff that's being planned that hasn't happened yet. And what's typical in the industry is that people often file plans for just huge systems, and then a lot of them don't get funded and built. So and I think so. I think yeah, I think we're just seeing, sort of like data centers. We're just seeing the tip of the iceberg here in terms of satellite. Yeah. But I would expect, probably in the hundreds of thousands. And there are questions of, do you sort of get an overly congested environment? And so a lot of it is coordination and use of spectrum, and then also as it gets very tight, your risk of collision goes up. And so I don't know that there's a hard number, but I think the belief is it's a lot significantly bigger than what we have today.
Yeah,
Brian,
because it
I'm sorry,
seems
go
to be
ahead.
all that, the issues with congestion and whether these satellites should really be competing with how much competition they should have with terrestrial solutions versus serving where terrestrial solutions are cost effective versus serving remote locations where terrestrial solutions are not going to be cost effective. So, you know, I have that question about really, you know, are these LEO satellites being allocated for the right purposes in all cases? How, because if they really needed to serve uh, remote locations or planes and all the markets you talked about where you need them, uh, has it really been assessed, whether there's how much additional bandwidth is available for areas where they're competing with fixed, terrestrial services that can serve those markets cost effectively, because we're going to have congestion in the skies from all these LEO satellite launch companies around the world. And I don't know that I've never seen any analysis of that type of thing. Are we using these LEO satellites for the right purposes?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and also one of the things too, if there's ever a collision, in space, if two things collide, they break into lots of pieces, and then each of those pieces becomes like a bullet out of a high-speed rifle that will do damage to other things. So there is there's always been a concern about space debris, but if you had collisions or an event, then it could be very, very consequential.
Right, right.
Brian, you actually had some comments about that in the chat. You want to share your thoughts?
Which ones? Yeah,
Ah,
I mean, Mark brings up, the point that, China just recently came out and said they want to deploy 200,000 satellites, and they went to the
Uh,
ITU on that. And, obviously the astronomy community has always been very vocal in this because it affects their science. And, you know, uh, there have been near collisions recently that have been in the news. I put one link in there. And there's also, this low Earth orbit visualization that Leo Labs, has. So just some areas, things to look at. But
okay.
yeah, I think the question, I think it was Henry brought up, how do you rationalize between satellite and fiber, and and where do they come into play? Is it, is satellite really for the rural areas mostly, or areas where it's not cost effective to bring fiber? And in the areas where fiber, can be deployed, that obviously provides more bandwidth and higher data rates and so forth. So a lot of considerations to think about, when you make trade-offs between fiber, satellite, and you know.
yeah, and I tend to be of the view that there's actually very little competitive overlap between the two, or there should be. That if you have a chance to buy fiber, get fiber. Don't
Right.
think don't think about it twice. But if you're trying to connect your RV, use
Yeah,
satellite, And so
yeah,
I think they're complementary. And obviously, people who've invested in satellite will try to nibble into other markets as much as they can. But fundamentally, the structure of the capabilities of the technologies are so different. And the beauty of fiber obviously is that it's multi-generational in its duration and it scales beautifully. So if you're in an area where it's economic to do fiber and it's a majority of U.S. homes right now. So it's the footprint is getting bigger and bigger. Then it's hard to compete with. But it doesn't negate the incremental kinds of things you can do with satellite.
yeah. We've got the same thing going, when you talk about satellite for tel cellular communications and the integration between the two, right? A little bit different from the broadband aspects, but you know, um, certainly direct to cell is another emerging area where we're going to see, the cell phone that you carry around today can be used for, anywhere where you have satellite coverage. So, if you move out of the terrestrial coverage areas out to, the middle of the Grand Canyon, where there's no cell towers, you could get your cell phone will still work through satellite coverage. That's the direction we're heading. And again, it's meant for those areas where it's not cost effective or prohibitive to put a cell tower in place. You use the cell tower in the sky in order to provide that. And the technology is such that you don't have to buy a new phone. It will be your cell phone that you carry around today.
Yeah, in fact, this is Bill, the
Like
OC.
Brian, have you ever brought up the issue with your wireless standards organizations like the International Telecommunications Union about looking at the issue of how many LEO satellites can be deployed in total, and how
Yeah,
they optimally should be used relative to the terrestrial solutions? Because it seems to me that's a big global issue that's going to be coming up with, like you say, China wants to launch 200,000 satellites and all the.
right. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. It certainly is a consideration. I know. I'm not directly engaged in that aspect of it, but yeah, it definitely it needs to be considered. Yeah, I mean there is only so much space where you can deploy,
right.
and yeah.
Yeah.
Bill,
Okay.
did you have something you wanted to add that I?
Well, I was just going to say I put a link in the chat to the Wireless Infrastructure Association's white paper on the whole topic of whether or not satellite will replace or complement. And I think Randy's exactly right. It's complementary service, and there are definitely some limitations, but there are huge benefits to augmenting the traditional infrastructure with it.
So Randy, can you explain in fairly simple terms? So the state approves LEO. How does that translate to a user in a rural community? How much do they pay? Who provides that? Do they contact Starlink? Do they go through another entity? How do they pay for that? Is that a short-term thing, a short-term subsidy for those people? Long-term, I'm not sure that we clearly understand how this relates to BEAD. At least I don't. Maybe others also.
Sure, sure. No, I'll kind of summarize what I understand from all the the NTIA the stuff. So basically, it operates a lot like any kind of terrestrial solution. So if there's a subgrantee who's offering fiber service or wireless service, they'll advertise and you'll call them up and subscribe. So just as they'll provide all of the equipment required and then have a service fee. Satellite will work the same way. The difference is that with a satellite provider, they'll have an in-service date, and many of them are saying 2027 for BEAD, a BEAD BEAD awards for satellite, and that'll sort of start the clock, and then they'll have an obligation for the next decade to provide their BEAD service, and they'll charge a monthly fee, but all of your equipment and installation will be covered. And if there's a weather event and it rips down your dish, they'll replace it, which is all very nice. So there's certain protections that you have under BEAD that are different than a consumer. Also, they have a commitment to provide qualifying service, which you don't necessarily have outside of BEAD. Although general rates are improving and getting better and better, and then basically, if you move, your home is still covered by bead, just as it would be with fiber. So whoever occupies your home next has those benefits. Even though technically you could take your dish and move, if you're a general satellite subscriber, in this case, bead is associated with the BSL, and importantly to their the satellite providers obligations, like their letter of credit, sunsets with a combination of the passage of time and hitting adoption milestones. So they are incented to actually get people to sign up.
Randy, Mark here. Just want to make one point about the number of BEAD allocations and funding they're getting may not bear a lot of reality to the number of subscribers they actually get. I mean, people may have found uh, uh, either the mobile version of fixed wireless access or the terrestrial multi-point traditional definition of fixed wireless access, for example, or still not be an uptaker of broadband of any kind, of which I think there's still 10% or so. So the fact that they have X amount of BEAD allocations may not bear a lot of relation to the number of BEAD subscribers they actually achieve.
Absolutely, yeah, no, absolutely, very good point. Yeah.
So would any of you guys want to be clairvoyants about the future for satellite? You guys were talking about now that satellite is kind of complementary to fiber. But if you look at how technology has changed and continues to change, even in the past 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, um, where are we going to be? I kept saying that, if we fool around with this stuff long enough, that technology will solve the issue about broadband everywhere. I'm just curious if you guys have any thoughts about, are we talking 5 years away where satellite will be able to do everything we can do with fiber?
No.
I think that's vastly overstated because there are limitations, like I say, on how many LEO satellites you can put up there, how many customers you can serve with all that. And with fiber, it's much more, you know, much more scalable.
And Mark, again, everything you can do with fiber, never. Fiber will always be likely an order of magnitude more capacity terrestrial than satellite. As satellite moves to 1 gig, fiber moves to 10 gig.
Yeah.
I kind of see but who needs more than 1 gig? Who are the people or applications that need, that high a level service? So I do see satellite availability as ubiquitous. I do see their pricing becoming more and more competitive as there are multiple competing constellations, and they'll be a big player. But a lot of people are quite satisfied with their mobile phone uh, plan for what that industry also calls fixed wireless access. Always confusing to me that they use the same term we've traditionally used in a different sense for terrestrial point to multi-point. One other point about the future I'd make, Steve, is that we're now seeing Google and several others looking at putting what they call data centers in space. And there are reasons for that. One is that there's an incredible amount of data generated by Earth observation satellites and their imaging and sensing that can be offloaded and dealt with at the edge. This is really edge computing. And some feel that data centers in space get you past some of the power, water, and other things that terrestrial data centers. Getting those to scale seems, I don't know, if not impractical, quite difficult to me as a terrestrial data center replacement. But there are multiple efforts to put what are called data centers in satellites in space right now.
Yeah, Steve, I would say no, I don't see that replacement ever happening. I see the satellite as always being the last option, and the reasons are really purely technical. The latency, the capacity, the performance, and also the spectrum availability that is so widely deployed on the wireless side today. I don't see that changing.
Yeah, and I think that just in an urban center, the economics of satellite just doesn't work. It's completely upside down. And so, fiber is just so compelling once you hit density. And I don't see a replacement ever occurring, but I do, and I see maybe two things: satellite encroaching on wireless broadband. So I see a greater sort of competitive interaction there, and things like direct to cell is also interesting. Like SpaceX spent $18 billion for a big block of spectrum and that's a whole another subject. That's something I didn't cover in today's slides, but it's also a really interesting arena where satellite is probably very complementary to terrestrial infrastructure, just because when you're building a cellular network, it's really, really expensive to cover absolutely everywhere. And so there's a really nice dynamic there as well.
Okay. Any other thoughts, comments?
And I dropped
Going
the
once?
slides in the chat too. And they have links, which are helpful.
Thanks, Randy. That was great. Thank you. And
Yeah.
early in the
Thanks, Randy.
chat, I posted both the PDF and a link to a presentation of mine from a little over a year ago, but a really deep dive into the satellite industry, focused on both the launch capability, the broadband capabilities, and the Earth observation segment of that market. So it's only slightly dated, I would say, after a year or so, but my own deep dive is there as well.
Yeah, that's excellent, and that's there's a ton of stuff that went into that as well. So that's definitely really valuable stuff there.
So just a reminder that while I will capture these presentations and include them when I send out uh, my newsletter with links to be able to download those. But just keep in mind, first of all, as I always remind people, you can download the chat now if you want it, if you need it. If you don't want to wait for me to get it out, you can download it now. If you go to chat, there's three ellipses, and you can download that. And again, I'll remind you that if you want to download a document of some kind, whether it's a PowerPoint, PDF, or whatever, you can download that from the chat now. But once the meeting ends, you cannot download that from the chat. So just a reminder that if you want any of those documents, now is the time to download them to your computer.
So, Steve, you're likely to post Randy's presentation on your
Yes,
meeting recap, right? That one
I will.
file
Yes, I will.
will be available later.
Yeah, well, it was an
Yep,
excellent presentation. It should be available to everybody. Yeah, that'd be good.
yep, absolutely. Okay, anything else for the good of the order today? Any other announcements people want to make? Okay, I'm going to stop recording. And
Steve,
if anybody wants,
just for a good of order, I just wanted
Lucy,
to, because this is pretty significant. There has been a time change based on feedback for the group on our biweekly health and education task force. So for those, I think most of you know me, but I'm Lucy Howell, founder of Force for Health. I've been helping co-lead a health and education task force on behalf of the key stakeholders here. And so the next meeting that we have is January 22nd. And the what I have added to our we've done 3 live broadcasts. They've all been an hour, October, November, and December. And when you look at the calendar link at the bottom, you will see everything that we've been working on this kind of ongoing Canva file. And I've put some data visualizations on some kind of key takeaways from each one of those episodes. And so that file on the invite link actually has everything intact. So we did move it to 2 o'clock, not 3 o'clock, to accommodate some folks. And then we will do our first live for 2026 in February. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. Anything else? Melanie, do you have anything that you want to share real quickly? You've got the council meeting coming up pretty quickly here if we didn't miss it already.
We do. It's next Wednesday. Thank you for asking, Steve. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Melanie Escher with the Arizona Telemedicine Program and the Southwest Telehealth Resource Center here at the University of Arizona. And Randy, it was I was fascinated by talking about the satellites, only because my daughter graduated with her master's degree in optomechanical engineering and is dealing with space optics out in Virginia. So, and she shared with me that image that I posted, what the Earth atmosphere actually looks like with all the satellites compared to what it has in the past. And unless you actually see that picture, it's like, holy smokes, you have no, I mean, it's just a cloud of, it just looks like a cloud of crap, just orbiting around the Earth. I mean, the technology is amazing. And, I mean, that's how we're getting, healthcare out to those that need it, by having those links and technology available. But yeah, it's amazing. So I really appreciated your presentation on that and that different perspective. Anyway, so yes, our council meeting is next Wednesday. We've got our first developing for 2026 will be Tuesday, January 27th. Registration is open for that. And I have been feverishly working on my webinar series for 2026 and getting speakers and presenters and topics all lined up. So check our website and go ahead and register for some of our webinars and our educational events. Look forward to seeing everyone again.
Great, thanks, Melanie.
Sure.
Anybody else have anything else that they want to share? I'm going to stop recording now.
Steve, one more thing on satellites. I don't know that Randy mentioned that, but what we're really seeing right now is the latest generations and future generations of satellites will have what are called intersatellite links that are optical. So it was Melanie's talk about her daughter that reminded me. And what this really means is that rather than passing traffic necessarily to the ground, they'll pass it satellite to satellite at fiber optic speeds and hand off. So these are 4 steerable laser transmitter receivers in each satellite. And that really ups the game for capacity, something Henry asked about generally, in that they rely less on ground station services and more on this kind of fiber optic equivalent, fiberless optic network, I guess it is, in space. And there is a trend towards optical ground stations that again would have a bypass to the limitations of radio spectrum and move up to light spectrum, though there are weather issues with laser optical ground stations in inclement weather. They always have to be backed up by RF capabilities as well. But that is another trend we're seeing, is these intersatellite links that are optical and the emergence of ground stations that also will be optical.
So Randy, I think Brian dropped off, and I think he touched on this a little bit. But is there? I mean, the world is in such chaos at the moment. But with all the different countries all um, putting satellites up. I mean, we know the FCC has control here in the US, but what about, is there an international group of some kind that's trying to control all of this? I mean, we're going to have so many satellites as we were just talking about. Is there a mechanism for how that's all going to be managed?
Oh yeah, no, that's a really important question. So so basically people file with their local country regulator, and then also with the ITU, and there's also the World Radio Conference, which I think and is at 2027, but it happens every few years, and it's geared around primarily coordination of spectrum. And so what's interesting with satellite, there's certain rules that apply around the world, but then a particular country can relax them or do things slightly differently as long as they don't conflict. So, for instance, I think the U.S. May be on a path where we have say the mobile satellite and fixed satellite coordination is a little bit more relaxed than it is at the international level. But actually having a consistent set of rules is important because when you launch a LEO system, for it to be economic, you've got to sell it in Europe and in India and Africa and around the world. And if you're not able to do that, then there's an economic impact. And I think that'll also limit the total number of LEO systems. At a certain point, you run out of market share for this kind of stuff.
But is the ITU regulating the number of LEO satellites that can be put up? No one seems to be regulating that, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. Like I don't think there's any organization that says top down the world would benefit from this number of LEO systems. This is what
Right.
we're going to build. It's more, if investors want to invest, then they do, and the constraints are just bandwidth or other things. But yeah, so there's not a top down decision making that says fiber will have this and satellite will have that, and we won't overbuild. So I think that the overbuilding is definitely a possibility.
It seems to me to be going to be a major concern that the UN or ITU is
Yeah.
going to have to take a role in, because there's going to be this overcrowding issue, and how much LEO satellite should be used versus the terrestrial solutions. That's going to be a international issue that is going to have to be dealt with. So,
Yeah,
Okay.
I totally
I'm
agree.
sorry, go ahead, Randy.
no, that's all I wanted to say, but I think it's something I haven't heard it brought up yet. So hopefully it will be addressed properly at some point internationally.
Okay, anything else for the good of the order? If not, I believe we are done for today. Thank you all for being here. Hopefully we'll see you next week.
Good.
Okay. Thanks very much, Randy, for the great
Great
presentation.
job, Randy. Thank you.
Okay.
Got lots